the topic ethnic power and racism in Guyana can properly be retitled as the history of politics in Guyana. I want to perhaps start by saying that it is important. One cannot start a discussion about race in Guyana without, first of all, understanding the history of our peoples in Guyana. And what is also equally important is that when we discuss the issue of race, I think we should all undertake to be honest and candid, because to really have a successful discussion or begin to have a discussion which addresses the core problem, I would say, in Guyana, requires at least some degree of commitment to truth, honesty in relation to our history, past as an immediate past, and of course, longer term history. Because if one can't start to discuss politics and race in Guyana starting in 1955 or starting in 1964 or 66, or wherever you choose to pick a marker, I think one has to have a very keen understanding of the history. And I know some people will say that, the historians will say that, there are different interpretations of history, but there's some aspects of history that are important, and I think can be varied. And I think also we have to have a commitment going forward to relying on accurate data, because otherwise you're going to be having a discussion of rhetoric between various sides, and that doesn't help. So I don't propose to give a history lesson tonight, but what I wanted to do is to touch on some key aspects of our history so that we have to understand where every ethnic constituency or every racial constituency in Guyana comes from. Because unless we understand at a deeper level both the fears, the emotional, the political, and other physical fears as well of our people, we won't be able to really start to confront this issue. And so, of course, going all the way back, and I only picked this date as a marker, but not as the beginning of time, and that's 1492. All of us, except the very young ones, I suspect, when we attended school, were told, of course, that this part of the world was discovered by some European man called Columbus. The reality is that long before Columbus got here, we had the indigenous people. And we all know now two things. One is that Columbus didn't discover anything. He couldn't discover peoples that were here before. And secondly, the whole concept of country and boundaries, which we are all tied to today, didn't exist in terms of, or certainly did not exist in terms of the indigenous persons who inhabited the geographical space, which is now Guyana. Of course, in the north, the indigenous people in the north were completely separate peoples from those who were in mid-Guyana, those who were in Upper Mazaruni, where you had the Akawaya and the Arakunas. Of course, the Caribs and the Arawaks are the principal ones up in the north. And then you go all the way further south, you go to Makushi and all the rest. So this landmass, first of all, didn't have defined boundaries. The boundaries that existed between the various peoples that were here at the start tended to be geographic, and I picked the easiest one as those in the Upper Mazaruni, Middle and Upper Mazaruni. They were caught by the mountainous regions that surrounded the area where they lived, as they claimed from time immemorial. Of course, when the Europeans got here, the entire, and this is really key to understanding Guyana, that from the time the Europeans got and met with the indigenous people here, they were driven by one force, and that is economic exploitation. And let's understand that even though religion came with it, the sole purpose of their venture into this part of the world was economic. And so consequently, they started bringing the Africans as chattel slaves here. They were considered property, and they were brought for the purpose of the use of their labor on the estates. Started somewhere around 1565, where the first Dutch settlement came. And we know for the next 250 years, until we got to 1838, the Africans were the persons who were used to build all the sugar plantations. Before we get to 1838, what is very significant is after the Europeans had stopped fighting themselves in Europe in 1815, we actually had actually, it's back in 1803, but it was a result of the several wars. Napoleon had gone berserk and what have you. We actually had the merging of Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice into one territory known as Guyana. 1815, they settled their peace in Europe. They stopped killing themselves. And it's interesting to note that in 1815, there was no such thing as Germany. You had Prussia and other places. So understand that the history of nations, Germany didn't exist in 1815. So by the time we get to 1838, actually 1832, when they had announced the abolition of slavery and they realized that they had to have replacement labor, or they anticipated that the African labor force either would not want to go back to the sugar estates, so they were not going to have them, they were going to exclude them from the sugar estates. They announced the abolition of slavery. That's an important point for this reason, because for a lot of Africans whose foreparents were here, and the reason why I say that history is important is one has to understand each other. For a lot of the Africans who were here, they thought that for the last 200 plus years, their labor had been used to build what is now modern Guyana. If you think of the entire coast that was uninhabited, it was mosquito infested, flooded lands, all the drains that existed, all the canals, the entire infrastructure of Guyana today, modern Guyana, the building of the seawall, etc., that labor had come solely and exclusively from the African people. So by the time you get to 1838, I think the Africans felt that certainly they didn't have any concept of independence of Guyana at that time, because that was just not on. The superiority of the white people was a presumed global phenomenon. But they certainly thought that they were entitled to be in where they were. England, of course, dominated the world, and they brought most of the replacement labor after experimenting, of course, with the Portuguese, Chinese, and others. They brought most of the labor in from India, because India was completely dominated by the British at the time. So when the Indians started coming when the British started bringing the Indians in 1838, the Africans who had just been emancipated, of course, had no economic base before, decided that they would start to build their own communities. They pooled their resources. They purchased several estates along the coast. And there was very little interaction between the Indian indentured labor that came and the Africans. And there was a lot of reasons for that. Indian indentured labor that came to Guyana was actually tied to an estate. So when you sign the contract with whoever you signed the contract with in India, and they came here bound to an estate. So when you hear, for example, people refer to Chetty as coming from Port Morant Bound Yard, that was a yard to which his ancestors were bound. And they started to bring the indigenous population in 1838. And as I was saying, there was very little interaction because the Indians were brought purely for specific estates. So, for example, they came for Port Morant. They weren't allowed to leave Port Morant unless they got a pass. So there wasn't a lot of interaction initially between the African and Indian population. Of course, the African population, for several reasons. One, even though they bought the villages, a lot of the colonial masters, the white colonial masters, would flood their estates, and therefore the estates could no longer, the communities that the Africans had bought, they could no longer sustain all of their people, and a lot of people started to migrate to Georgetown or wherever the centers were. New Amsterdam was a big capital in those days. So a lot of the Africans moved there. Of course, you have the color segregation because, of course, the white slave masters used to get away and go in and impregnate a lot of the black women. So you had the whites at the top and the reds, the descendants of the house slaves, etc., coming down. And because the Africans were forced to go for labor or to make a living in the centers like New Amsterdam, Berbice, and wherever they were, and because at that time the society had put a lot of emphasis on public appearance and jobs that gave you standing. Social standing was more important than economic standing. So people who got jobs as teachers, policemen, in the civil service, they got a fixed salary, felt that they were naturally higher up the social scale than the Indians, who they called coolies in the days, who would come. A lot of them were not necessarily literate, and they felt that they were better educated and better disposed in the society, which was a Caucasian society and structured in a Caucasian way. So what happened is that a lot of the Africans adopted the prejudices that the Europeans had towards the indigenous, and the Europeans had towards both the indigenous and the Indians. And the Europeans fed that, of course, by promoting that in the African communities. And of course, by that time, most of the Indians were bound by contracts to the respective estates, and they were treated, quote unquote, as coolies, who were supposed to be the uneducated bunch. The arrangements between the state and the Indians under the contract offered essentially, and this is just a generalization, you had the option of returning home at the end of your period, or you would get land. So at the end of the period, if you're a family, you'd get 6 acres. And if you had up to 6 to 10 children, you can end up getting 12 acres if you were an Indian family. None of this was available to the African community. So the economic base of the Indian community, if you didn't go back to India, you actually got land, 6 acres at a minimum as a family, and it go up to 12, depending on the number of children in the family. So that economic base, the Indian community acquired, and of course, as you know, once you got land, you get a tradable security or a commodity that you could go to the bank. Having said that, the Africans who bought those areas, of course, bought communities, but those communities, they couldn't go to the bank per se as Buxton community or Victoria, even though they owned it by transport. You know, they couldn't go to the communities, but they organized themselves. The front lands were where they lived. The pasture was in between, and then you had at the back, you had agricultural lands. And as time moved on, of course, as more Indian people came to the end of their contracts, a lot opted not to go back home, and of course acquired land. So they had a stronger economic base. The African population, which was moving up the ranks of the civil service, of course, at the top of the civil service, the lightest skinned, it was the whites at the top, and then the red people. And red is not what we call red today. It was the exceedingly light-skinned people. They were a lot lighter than what we call red in Guyana. And they were the only people that got the higher-end civil service jobs. So, for example, the Secretary of the Treasury would have been a very, quote-unquote, high red. So they have this social structure. And coming as we move forward into the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s, the social clubs reflected very accurately the racial segregation in the country. So you had the White People's Club, which was the Planters Club, the Planter Class Club. That's where they went and they socialized in the evening. And of course, they would discuss business. And that was the Georgetown Club. Right next door to the Georgetown Club was what we call now Colgrain House, where the Ministry of Telecommunications was during the APNU AFC administration. That was where the head of bookers used to live. And the whole of Guyana was actually, they used to call Guyana Booker Guyana, because everything that happened on the economic front, bookers owned. They owned not only the sugar estates, they owned the pharmacy. GPC used to be Booker's Pharmacy. They owned actually most of the economic activity that happened. And if it wasn't Booker's, the next in line after them was a company called Sproston's. Again, that's where Munishwar's is now. So that was the second area. So the top and the social clubs, as I was saying, the top was Georgetown Club, and the head of Booker's lived next door in Colgrain House. After that, you had the Portuguese Club, which, if I recall correctly, was somewhere on Thomas Lands. You had a Red People's Club. So you didn't even get to the bottom of the private. You had a Red People's Club, which also was on Thomas Lands. You had the Indian Club, which is Everest. The Black People's Club was called the Demerara Cricket Club. And the Chinese had their own club. I think it might have been, it's where GMR and Essino is. At the time it was, I can't remember if it was Cosmos, but they had a Chinese. And that was essentially how Georgetown was structured. And Georgetown reflected essentially the social standing in the society. New Amsterdam was a very, very powerful center for business. And they had the same stratifications, white at the top. Well, most of the whites started to move out. Then you had red and various shades of red. Africans. And at the bottom of that pile, back in between 1900 and 1940, the bottom of the pile was actually considered at the time the Indian population, because they were bought as contract labor. They were considered bound to various estates, and the prejudices that the Caucasian population had to the Indians, a lot of the African population adopted. So they felt like the Europeans, that somehow, they were different. So like I said, the economic base for the Indian population came about, the 6 acres plus an option for another 6. And so in the 1900s, you had people like Critchlow who were organizing labor in Georgetown. And that labor, of course, was essentially African, because you'd never used to see a lot of Indians in Georgetown in the early 1900s, because, of course, most of them were bound to the estates. So a lot of the labor, for example, the dock workers and what have you, they were organized by Critchlow, 1900s, were essentially African-based, and you had the start of the trade union movement. Around this, the other thing that was going on in Guyana, apart from sugar, was, of course, a lot of gold was going on and being found in the interior, and a lot of blacks would, especially from the coast, would go into the interior, and that's how you got the whole pork knocker. So you fast forward all the way to somewhere around 1947, when Dr. Jagan had returned to Guyana. By 1947, when he returned, and of course, Guyana has always been very, very politically aware of what is happening. Critchlow was ahead of his time and ahead of the Caribbean back in the 1900s. Chetty came back with his wife. And by that time, understand that the people in the Caribbean knew that independence was going to come, because the big jewels in the English crown, India, followed by Kenya, they knew that once they got independence, the rest of the society, the rest of their colonies were going to go. So Guyana had no big war, as they like to say, or big civil commotion about independence, because by the time Chetty and Forbes came back from England. He's very articulate, good-looking banner. Chetty was exceedingly good-looking. And the dynamics of these two people, who both espoused a left of center socialist heading the communist philosophy, was of course quite captivating for the mass of people, both African and Indian, because of course these were two young people who were articulating a vision where they were talking about the command of the economy, taking over, governing yourself, independence, and the combination of the Black and the Indian. Chetty, of course, was extremely popular in the rural communities, and if you could imagine, in Georgetown, a lot of the people who are lighter skinned upwards turned their noses at the whole concept of independence, and the fact that, oh my God, these natives, either African or Indian, were eventually going to run the country. So they had a lot of other social dynamics going on. So politics is not politics is a blood sport. And understand that, we may articulate a lot of fancy ideals, but at the end of the day, the exercise of power for the distribution of resources is what this game in Guyana was all about. I forgot one significant day. In 1911, the number of Indians in the colony of British Guyana exceeded the Africans and it has never changed. So the British kept bringing more and more Indian labor for two reasons. One, they were afraid of the African labor because they had problems before 1763, way back when. But after that, you had an 1807 uprising, and then you had an 1823 uprising, which is the one where they beheaded 120 African slaves and put their heads on the top of poles in parade ground. So the English, who controlled the economy, wanted to make sure that they had enough Indians who outnumbered the Africans, because they were concerned about the Africans. And the other thing that happened, and this is relevant to the rise of the Portuguese, after the English started experimenting with Portuguese labor in the sugar estates, this is around 1833, and this is important. The Portuguese came a slightly better terms for the contract than the Indians, but the Portuguese came essentially because there had been 4 years consistent famine in Madeira, and people were literally starving. And as you know, Madeira, which is off of Portugal, were considered not quite white people because they're further south and a little less white, or I don't even want to say brown. You can't use brown in that context. So they came, and what happened was that the Portuguese, of course, couldn't stand up to the rigors of the labor in the sugar estate. And the Europeans, because they realized that on their physical appearance, the Portuguese were so close to the Europeans, they couldn't have them necessarily at the bottom of the ladder and treated the same way as these slaves or ex-slaves or the indigenous coolies, as they call them. So what they did is that the Portuguese, because a lot of them were farmers and had a sense of business, they were the only people who were given licenses to sell. So you couldn't sell liquor in the sugar estate, even though the Africans were emancipated since 1838. The only way you could sell sugar, liquor, flour, etc., was if you had a license from the state, and only the Portuguese got the license. So that's historically how come the whole business, all those dry goods stores, etc., we essentially Portuguese owned, DM Finance and what have you. And this happened throughout the course in the villages. You go to Buxton, that's how Buxton, BV, and all of them. That's how come you have Portuguese and Pleasance enclaves, was because they were the only people who were given licenses to sell either to the Indians or the Africans. The Europeans made sure that they did not give any licenses to the blacks because they were not going to empower in any sense, economically or politically, the African population. So to come back to Cherry and Forbes and when they got together late 1940s, this was, the bright spark of Guyana. But of course, and here's where you got to read your history and decide who you want to take. But essentially what happened is by the British, who understood that there, of course, was going to be a rivalry between Chetty and Forbes. The British, who also understood, and they did their psychological analysis exceedingly well. That's something we don't do in the third world, and particularly in Guyana. They both knew from analyzing both Chetty and Forbes that they were aware that Forbes was extremely ambitious, exceedingly cunning. They were talking to Forbes behind the back of Chetty Jagan. Of course, it is easy at the time because Jagan was very committed to quote unquote communism and the revolution of the world, because he had become very involved with leftist thinking. And of course, his wife was a Rosenberg, which some of the relatives, I think, were executed in the US for spying for Russia. So Chetty was deeply ideological. Burnham was a lot less ideological and a lot more perhaps opportunistic. And the British had analyzed these two guys beyond their wildest dreams. So Chetty, who was, of course, committed and always spouted the philosophy, and one of the ironies of Chetty spouting communism was that by the time you got to the 30s and 40s, because of a lot of the land moving into the Indian population, and the Indian population were allowed after a while to get licenses and do business, the Indian population had accumulated a lot more wealth than the African population, who were, teachers, et cetera, and had much smaller salaries. And so Chetty exposed exposed a philosophy, a political philosophy, communism, essentially, or socialism, which was contrary to what most of the Indian persons who were his traditional supporters wanted, because they, a lot of them had saved money. They owned the rice plots. A lot of the land that they got, they turned into rice fields. They would sell them, and they had accumulated significant amounts of money. But of course, the emotional pull is quite strong. And so the British understood that. And the other big thing that was happening internationally at the time was that the Americans were enforcing what they called the Monroe Doctrine, which was essentially they were asserting to the rest of the world, including the British, that the entire Central and Latin America was the American sphere of influence, and no other foreign country other than the Americans were going to exercise any dominance in the area. So the Americans and the British had a deal where they said, well, look, the British were going to pass over the overall political management of Guyana to the Americans. So, they knew the Americans were going to take this forward. And of course, the Central Intelligence Agency, when Cuba happened in 1959, I think, the uprising in Cuba, when Fidel then came into Havana. So the Americans were exceedingly paranoid about another Cuba in this part of the world. So they knew to start off that they were not going to give, even though they knew that Guyana was going to get independence, they were not going to give it to a person who was communist in political philosophy. So, of course, when the guys in Washington, the Central Intelligence Agency and the other political movements, and the guys in MI5 and MI6 back in the UK, realized that they're not going to give this to somebody who is so committed to the left, but they knew that Chedi had consistently won all the elections on the first past the post, 1953. And as you know, they suspended the constitution after 100 days, simply because politically naive, the rhetoric became more and more prominent. Burnham, very shrewd political mover, exceedingly shrewd. And if you look at a lot of Burnham's political moves, you probably see some of them reflected in the way Jack D operates. So Burnham knew and was very careful in his public statements about this socialism, etc., that he came over as moderate because he was talking to the British and the Americans on one side, and he wanted to be able to isolate Chedi because he knew after Chedi, he was the chairman of the party. And because of his ambitions, there was a very famous Congress that was coming up in the People's Progressive Party, of which Burnham was the chairman and Chedi was the leader. And he knew that at that Congress, very serious decisions were going to have to be made. So, of course, Chedi was campaigning and going around the place. He got arrested by the British, Martin Carter and some of them, and they got sent off to Sibley Hall, where Mazzaroni prison is. What that did was allow Burnham free reign politically, and he did this with not without the connivance of the British. E.U.C. Guyana, who was then Sidney King in the PPP, who was the other strong African leader in the PPP, apart from Burnham, because you had Chedi, and then you had Burnham, and both E.U.C. were quite prominent. Just as a historic note, Ashton Chase was the person who was considered the African leader, and then, of course, Burnham came back far more articulate, better looking, etc., and he became the person. E.U.C. Guyana was limited to campaigning at Buxton, which was his village. So Burnham, with Jagan in prison, I think, Janet was in prison, a couple of the other Indian leaders of the PPP were away, then held a conference of the PPP at which he then called a vote for him to become the leader. And what happened is there was a huge split because there were some arguments as to whether he could properly call the vote. He couldn't call the vote. And the PPP split between PPP Jagan and you had PPP Burnham. Long before the PNC, they had those two factions. And of course, naturally, what came out of that split was the political, I would say, the open political differences between the African and the Indian population. It didn't come over at that time because at the time of that split, a lot of the African people did not go with Burnham, for example. So Sidney King had not yet changed his name to U.C. Guyana. He stayed a Jagan supporter, and at Brindley Bend. So a lot of the Africans did not support this, or didn't support Burnham in the split. Anyway, the split eventually from PPP, Jagan PPP to PNC, to Burnham PPP, came around 1953 when the People's National Congress was formed. And the essential, the core support of the People's National Congress was Black, and which left Chedi, of course, because Chedi was always stronger in the rural communities, left, I don't want to say left, but the core support of the Jagan faction was Indian. Before that, a lot of the tensions existed in the party. Race was becoming a real issue because a lot of the urban Africans felt that, one, they felt that they were superior to the Indians at the time. Chedi was a communist, and that was like saying Chedi's the devil because, of course, we were fed all this stuff about communism. And that split between Burnham and Jagan, when he called the meeting, made himself leader, and then eventually by 1953 became the People's National Congress. The African support went to Burnham. What then happened within the PPP is that there was a faction, an Indian faction that was in Jagan's ear all the time saying, look, you see, Ghani take all the Black people. And as we were telling you this all the time, a lot of that was in Burnham's ear before the split as well. And after a while, people like Martin Carter, who had stayed with Jagan, moved over to Burnham. E.U.C. Guyana came over to Burnham. And that was really the core beginning of the politics of race in Guyana. So the split And this is where it's extremely important for the AFC to understand that the split came not on ideological grounds, but essentially this split was driven by the personal ambitions of these men. And they realized, like in politics, that if the base which is going to carry me to power is going to be my core ethnic supporters, then you got to pander to a certain extent to your base. So that split came, but under the first past the post system, and the British knew this well, the way the population was distributed, and remember the Portuguese had a very powerful partner in the United Force, so all the Portuguese used to vote for De Gaulle. The way that first past the post was structured, Chedi would always win. So they had a big election in 1961. And of course, in that election, the PNC was very badly beaten. I can't remember, 18-8 or something like that. But the numbers, when you combined the one man per vote, the numbers of the votes were, preponderance of the votes there were more people who voted against the PPP, i.e. for the UF and the PNC, than they were. And at that time, it became, and I think this became obvious to Burnham a long time before, that because of the numbers, and because since 1911, there were more Indian people in Guyana than the British had brought more Indian people than they had brought Africans who, well, they stopped bringing Africans from 1807. So it was just the local African population, the former enslaved. Burnham knew that numerically, he could never win an election on one man, one vote, especially in the constituency system. So what the British did with the Americans was that they decided that they were not, by that time, by 1961, big defeat for the PNC. Matter of fact, Burnham's best speech ever in his life, if you get an opportunity to hear it, and it was excellent, was at Merriman's Mall after the defeat in the 1961 election, I think it was, where he says to his supporters, "Will you wait with me for one more hour?" Which comes from Christ and after the Last Supper, and they were in Gethsemane. And he just spoke about the vision for Guyana, etc. To say that Burnham was more articulate than Jagan is a statement of fact. And he literally articulated this vision for Guyana. Of course, a lot of the American propaganda and the British propaganda was coming in saying Jagan was communist and he wanted to take your land, etc., etc. And Chedi in 61 introduced what was called the Caldor budget, which everybody classified as being very highly communist. Burnham gave that speech. The British and the Americans decided the only way they're going to beat Chedi or the PPP was if they changed the system from constituency to proportional representation. And there are a lot of good arguments in favor of proportional representation because, of course, you can win if, under the constituency system, the man who gets 51% of the seat gets the seat. And if that happens across all the constituencies, it means that you permanently have 49% of the population never winning a seat and always unrepresented. So there were a lot of good arguments for PR. The British decided they would change the system, which they did. They were in control ultimately of Guyana. We changed from first past the post to PR. Of course, huge civil war. Burnham, after he gave that speech, realized that not just Burnham, both sides, because there was a lot of pressure on both sides. Civil war started. Jagan, in his government, and especially the people that supported him, were very, very biased in the way contracts were given out. Same thing like today. Contracts are given out, the way in which people were given jobs, benefits, etc., etc. That came out. A lot of his ministers, as a matter of fact, some of the very prominent, very wealthy families got contracts that allowed them to amass great wealth. So the corruption was also there. The CIA, of course, was feeding a lot of money through the unions to the People's National Congress and the United Force. So literally our civil war began. One of the things that people don't understand is a lot of those bombings and stuff that took place and the incendiary devices, it wasn't the African population that did that because they just didn't have enough money to be able to buy bombs and buy grenades and stuff. It was Peter De Gaulle and the UF and the same Mr. Nascimento, who was head of the youth wing of the United Force, were the guys who used to go around and they were, they used to terrorize and throw bombs and plant bombs here and stuff, because they were the people that had the money. Some of that came in, of course, through the CIA, but essentially it was that class. We had elections, of course. The country was midst of civil war. They had elections in '64, as everybody knows. The United Force and the People's National Congress combined and, of course, formed the government. But you've got to remember at that time, and we have to assess the African population. At that time, Burnham understood, very smart guy, that, look, numerically, I will never be able to win an election on the number of Africans, because the population, the African population is somewhere around 28, maybe 29, 30%. The Indian population was definitely at 57, 58%. So he knew that that would never happen. And if there was ever, quote unquote, a free and fair election, that this is not going to happen. He also felt, like many African people feel, because we have to go into this when we analyze our ethnic politics, that having taken the free labor of their foreparents for over 200 years, up to 1838, they were entitled to this land. They were at least entitled because it was their labor and sweat that had built it. Everybody else, the indigenous that came before, weren't enslaved and essentially were hinterland people. And everybody else that came after that came on contract. They got paid for their labor. You can say the terms might not have been most favorable, but they got paid. So the African population had a very, very strong feeling that on the numbers, they were going to be completely excluded from the economic benefits of the country, because after having given free labor for 250 years, their numbers were now by design smaller than the Indian population that had come. Like I said, since 1911 was when the Indian population began to exceed the African population. And they felt, especially since their recent experience of the Jagan PPP government, from the time the 53 election came, and of course, again, afterwards with the ministers, where they felt they were excluded, they felt that no, they were going to be completely shut out from what was they're entitled to. So Burnham knew that, and he also knew at the same time that the United Force was a highly capitalist party based in privilege. They controlled the entire Water Street, which is the equivalent of Regent Street now, for those of you who are young. The center of gravity of business in Georgetown was where Guyana Stores is now, Booker's. Booker's was the big department store. The smaller one by a significant scale was Fogarty's. Across the road, you had Sproston's, which is now Muniswar's, and Water Street was the street. The Lebanese and Syrians who came, names like Abdel Noor and Bagdisi, they owned the rest of the stores. So it was either the Portuguese who owned most of the stores, or the Syrians. Syrians started coming hawking carpets and cloth, both of cloths, and they used to walk bolts of cloth. They used to walk down the road selling them. So Burnham knew that he was in a position where his core supporters had virtually zero economic power. The village movement had delivered and had organized a lot of the villages that were successful. But of course, you had a large urban population, a lot of them unemployed, and he understood that the economic structure, whites owning all the land at the top, Bookers owned all the sugar estates. Imagine all the land on the entire coast of Guyana was owned by Bookers. So he knew, and the other big center of gravity for economics was Linden, which was the Demerara Bauxite Company, Canadian Bauxite Company. So all of this stuff was owned by foreigners. And immediately after the foreigners, in terms of economic power, was the Portuguese. So he knew that inevitably the Portuguese and the blacks, even though they were in a political union, were going to come to grief. And that is a lot of what drove Burnham to start interfering with the electoral process from 1969. And that continued until 1992. It was born out of fear, because the only way he could deliver any sort of economic resources and change the economic imbalance in the society was if he remained in power, and to do that, he had to rig. So from between 1972 and 1974, he nationalizes sugar. Now, that was a big, big, big economic burden, but the good thing was that sugar prices were extremely high. And even though he had rigged the elections and the relations between the Indians and the blacks were poor, and between him and Chetty were strained, Chetty politically supported because of his politics, because he was more left to Burnham all the time, he supported the fact that the state was going to take control of the economic heights, as they call it, of the population. So all the nationalizations, Gaisuco first, because sugar was great, the price of sugar was great, the best crop we've ever had in terms of money was 1974. So at the time, if things had continued along that trend, we would have been able to pay, we had to pay Booker. He then nationalized Demerara Bauxite Company. Chetty supported all of this. It was called critical support because he felt that at the end of the day, the locals need to control the economy. And of course, a lot of the local Indian businesses found that they now were going to be in a position to provide a lot of the goods and services that the white people were previously, that had previously survived. What then happened is we had in 1974, the oil crisis. And the price of oil went up by 200-300%. OPEC took over the world prices, and that killed Guyana's social experiment. Problem was we were committed to the economic path that we were. Things got bad because we couldn't pay our external debt. The exchange rate started to go through the roof, and the domestic social circumstances and economic circumstances got tighter across the board. Burnham knew that to stay in power, he would need some means of enforcing this. So he started to build a lot of paramilitary. He set up the National Service. National Service is a two-sword thing in the sense that its intentions were very good. It was the first time, if you talk to both Africans and Indians who went to the National Service, it was the first time people from the Indian population would actually meet people from the African population in a social setting when they went off to the centers. And they'd have to work together, get up at 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 to do drill, et cetera, et cetera. And as a social experiment, it worked very well at that level. But because by that time, Burnham was a dominant political figure and everybody thought that this was just him and his megalomania. But if you talk to a lot of people, they said that was the best time. And for a lot of persons, it was the first time, if you were African and urban, that you actually came into contact with an Indian person and saw how they lived, and vice versa for Indian people. But the National Service, because of a lot of the political rhetoric, got a lot of bad name. But Burnham also knew that he had to build up the paralegals to be able to control the power of the state. That just kept getting worse. People's militia came around, the GDF had to swear allegiance to the People's National Congress, and we went through that whole era where the party flag was flying in front of the Court of Appeal. And what is also significant is that by the time you got to the late 70s, Rodney came back here somewhere around 76, 77. A lot of African persons started to challenge Burnham. And when you go back to the data and you read the books, most of the people who were either murdered, assassinated, or disappeared during the People's National Congress reign were African. Rodney happens to be the most prominent, but there are a lot of other people, and the party that suffered the most in terms of loss of people was the Working People's Alliance, because they had decided that they had to challenge this Burnham dictatorship, and they were prepared, as Rupert Rupnarain admitted maybe about 8-9 years ago, they were prepared to take the struggle to escalate the struggle to an armed struggle. Jagan's approach was, of course, to have strikes. You would burn sugar cane. Burnham would bring in scab labor, but and now and then you would hear that maybe somebody like Arnold Rampersad, I don't know how true that is, did intend to try anything, but that had no chance of success. The people who began to really rattle Burnham in the late 70s were the Working People's Alliance. And you had this very charismatic Rodney that was talking about the unity of the peoples. Never before Rodney started to raise the issue of the unity of the working class of Guyana has any political party ever seriously addressed the issue of race. Rodney started to address it at the political level. Naturally, Rodney, because he was African, was more a threat to Burnham than he was to Jagan. But Jagan was no friend of Rodney either. He was a friend in the sense that an enemy of my enemy is my friend, so he supported him paternally. But Jagan wanted to become the leader. Rodney had become this new star. He got assassinated. Depends on who you read. He either blew himself up or Burnham killed him. You read the history. I wouldn't offer a view on that. after Rodney was removed from the political scene, there was no rival African to challenge Burnham. And my personal view is, up to this day, if Rodney had lived and we had free and fair elections, which was not possible in 1980, but if we had them, Chetty Jagan would have won, just like how the PPP won in 92, simply because the numbers were always in favor of the Indian population. And Rodney would have just split the African vote. Rodney might have got a couple percentage of the urban Indian, but that, like it is, that percentage is very small. It didn't exist. It would not have changed the dynamics. And of course, the rest is hidden. Rodney goes, economy crashes, Burnham dies. By the time, of course, between 80 to 85, I think were the worst years of Burnham. I think he really went off the charts in those years. He died. Of course, his party had declared itself socialist. In 1985, Hoyt came. Hoyt, knowing what happens in the reality with the numbers were that he couldn't win a free and fair election, also knew that this socialist experiment couldn't work. He cut a deal with the West and literally said to the People's National Congress, we got to turn around, we got to privatize, et cetera, because that was the only way Guyana was going to get out of its debt trap. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction in the African community about Hoyt. Come 92, however, of course, you have a free and fair elections, and naturally the People's Progressive Party was going to win, even though there was significant dissatisfaction with Burnham, with the PNC. The People's Progressive Party still needed a vote or so from the Working People's Alliance, I think in one of the rural constituencies, and took over. But from 92, the African population felt completely excluded. It didn't start that way, but there were a couple of pointers that began to trigger in the African community that they would be excluded. So Chetty made a very unfortunate statement when he was trying to explain a problem in Guyana and said, Black people at the bottom of the social ladder, or the last rung of the social ladder. Of course, that got taken into a different context. And after that, Black persons started to get excluded. And the AFC needs to understand that, because if you are a leader in a party, you're under a lot of pressure. So Chetty, no doubt, was under a lot of pressure from the Indian supporters in his party saying, look, the people ruled for so long, you got to give me this contract, give me that, you got to set this up, blah, blah, blah. So he's under that pressure. The African population clearly not supporting him. So it's not going to be there. The leader he chose, or the person he chose to be Prime Minister, Mr. Hines, was not a leader in the African community and did not have much respect in the African community. And as you know, in politics in Guyana, you can't pick and pluck somebody from another community and put them there and say, oh, they represent your interests. It just doesn't happen. So after, unfortunately, Chetty died in 97, I think it was, his wife took over. And that, I think, that set off the African population, because after having fought so much, you had Burnham, who spoke so much about the destiny and the mold and you're justifying your aspirations. To have a Caucasian woman come and run a country, literally, you couldn't ask for a political event that would galvanize the people. So the African people said, absolutely no way. We couldn't have, 1763 uprising and come through all the uprisings to vote for a Caucasian person or have a Caucasian person as your leader. So that was a big rallying point. And as you know, between 97 and 2000, a lot of dissent took place. The civil service went on strike. They were taking white dolls and putting pins in them and saying we're working in Janet and stuff. And the underlying race relations became really, really, really bad. We changed the constitution. We created what was potentially the most modern constitution, but at the same time, both the PPP and the PNC wanted to dominate the political space if they were in office. They had no consideration whatsoever. They didn't want to create any space whatsoever for anybody other than themselves in office to exercise power. So the big constitutional talk, there was no discussion whatsoever about the powers of the president. They didn't want to clip that. They didn't want to clip the way in which the powers were divested, whether you move the powers from the center out, which would give all the other regions and areas outside of the capital a lot more autonomous power, which would begin to address the racial issue, because each one of them wanted to dominate the other if they got into power. And so when we had that opportunity to change the constitution, the major political players decided they would not decided, knew that they were not going to change that because they wanted to dominate. And I remember my father-in-law, who was involved in shuttling diplomacy between the PNC and the PPP at the time. He always said to me that he never forgets the meeting, and it came from both sides. I think he met with, might have been Hoyt, and he was meeting with Janet. And both of them said that between the PPP and the PNC, we control 97% of this electorate. And who are you, social partners, and everybody else to tell us how we should run this country? So understand at the base level, the PNC and the PPP were of the view, identical view, that between the two of them, 97% of this population would vote for them. And therefore, it is in that context that they viewed everybody else as an interloper. So any third party that came after that would have been a challenge to them. And that is where the AFC is today. So we had that. We had the electoral reform. Mr. Jagdeo went in. Mr. Jagdeo went in with great promise. He was young. He was seen as not of the generation of the race riots from the 60s. And everybody thought that this is a young guy. He's not going to be caught by the racial politics and the polarization, et cetera, et cetera. He's going to actually take the country forward. You know that didn't happen. And we all lived in Guyana through the Jagdeo era, so we know what happens. So come 2005, when the country is exceedingly despondent about the future, Corbyn is head of the PNC. There's no way he can win an election. He can't even get all the African support out. Jagdeo was there. Clearly by that time, he was clearly very biased in his approach to power and politics, and his friends and what have you were getting all the contracts. No development taking place in any of the other communities, handouts and patronizing statements. And emerging out of that, you have, well, before they emerged, a lot of the population felt that Guyana was in a hopeless case. This is a basket case. It was only a matter of time before we end up, in real civil war again. Excuse me, much better armed than we were before, and that the country would disintegrate. The Americans, of course, always ahead of everybody. They do all the research. They realize what's going to happen. Remember, the economy going up and down, all we had was sugar. Rice was all over the place. They realized that there was a need for a third view, a third force to take the country forward. There were a lot of progressive statements were coming out. Starbuck News, which had been created under Hoyt's time, was promoting the idea. And out of that, of course, the megalomania of the power of Mr. Jagdeo in control of the PPP expelled Kemraj. Raphael, who was saying to the African population of the PNC, we got to do a different line of politics. We can't continue this way. You're never going to get power. You don't have the numbers. We have to reform. We have to live together with each other. We're in the same land mass, blah, blah, blah. That, in that milieu, you then have Kemraj and Raphael, essentially. Sheila did come, but with the greatest respect to Sheila, I don't think Sheila was as prominent within the WPA as these two gentlemen were in their respective parties. And Guyana had some serious hope for the first time of a third party, of a real third party. Not because they had tons of third parties before. The UF came, died. Llewellyn John had a party. If you go through the history, everybody, the Eagle has landed. This was the first time Guyana had a real chance at third party politics. Raphael and Kemraj get together. They brought with them the respect from and standing they had in the two parties, and they held out the prospect of a new Guyana. So 2006 elections comes, and they break all the records in the Caribbean. They got 5 seats. It has never happened that a third party who has entered politics for the first time, 1 year old, gets 5 seats. But unfortunately, both of these guys, because they had not led before, they misinterpreted what was in effect a success as a defeat, because for some reason somebody fed them some real high protein ganja and tell them they could win. I don't know any place where a third party comes for the first time and wins. They did exceptionally well, but because they had been, the Americans, whoever else or whoever was saying that, look, you're going to do better. So they won, and they held the 5 seats. They continued to articulate in Parliament, and that was the first signaled to the two major parties that they have a problem. But they didn't know if it was a flash in the pan. So they continued to articulate a different and better way. While the PNC was only talking about local government elections, you had Kemraj, particularly Kemraj, who was out there very aggressive, talking about a different way, constitutional reform, all this kind of stuff was coming out. And the population was like, we need a break from these two existing guys. So there was a lot of sympathy for them. And then you come to the 2011 election. By this time, of course, Jagdeo can't run again, which is clearly in control of things. He puts up Donald Ramotar. You had gone through those awful years of the, what do you call it, the crime spree, you know, all the, how many hundred people murdered and what have you. And the AFC does better. That put it in the record books again, because most of their parties that start, when you think in Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, they don't sustain themselves to the next election to do well. AFC actually comes and does better than it was before. They increased their seats, and they had stolen seats from them before, because the population had a yearning for a different day. They do that, and they do a lot of political work. And because of the numbers and the assessment done, they came to a place in 2014 where they had to, end of 2014, the question was, the PPP had become, apart from the corruption, Ramotar never reached out. So he didn't take the fact that he was a minority government into context and start to have serious discussions. I mean, I'm sure in his quieter moments, if he looks back, at 2011 was the opportunity he had to start discussions with the Alliance for Change, because the Alliance for Change wasn't committed to the PNC in those days. The party had strong support, both sides of the fence. I can come to that shortly. I'm about to wrap up. So come 2011, Ramotar didn't reach out. He continued in this lager, you know, the South African, you rung the wagons. And the AFC was definitely had increased its population, was across the board, and we're going to come to analyzing population in a minute. So, but they knew that the AFC couldn't win an election. And the question was, can the country, by that time it was 23 years, sustain another term of the People's Progressive Party in office? Because, of course, the dissent after 23 years of, in effect, PPP rule, which is seen as Indian rule, on the amount of disaffection in the African population was very, very palpable. People were thinking of doing unorthodox things because they couldn't continue to survive. So the AFC had a real issue then. What I will say is that the racial differences that exist in the population were manifest in the AFC all the time. What the AFC did was it brought, one, an intellectual approach to the issue of race in politics without saying it, and saying that, look, there is a different way. Because the PPP didn't have to say race and the PNC didn't have to say race, because that's what they were about. There was never an argument about ideology. Yeah, you could have an argument about whether you want hydropower or not, but that was never really the argument. Those parties knew that their core constituencies were African and Indian. The AFC came, and because the enemy that you had to defeat at that time was the People's Progressive Party, then it was important that you take votes away from the People's Progressive Party more than if you took votes away from the People's National Congress. Because if you're taking votes away from the People's National Congress alone, then you weren't going to change the fact that the PPP would win the election. And so they were faced with a real dilemma at the time. I never forget that when this was put to the floor of the Alliance for Change, all the darker side of our insecurity surfaced. And it was clear that the approach of one side to the problem in Guyana, clearly, and justifiably so, the Indian population had real fears about going into an arrangement with the African population, because the commitment of the Alliance for Change was to, as Kemraj says, I think he said dead meat if you join with any of them, was that the AFC was going to lead a separate and independent path. And I know that the pundits are still out as to whether or not, had they led an independent path, that Guyana would have been in a different place. But we're not here to second guess. That was the issue that was facing them at the time. And when this was put to the floor of the Alliance for Change, I was the chairman at the time, a lot of the deep-seated fears that we all have of the other side emerged. And those fears emerged because, of course, of our historic experience. But nobody wanted to put this on the table. And the Alliance for Change at that time, because they were facing another 5 years of the PPP, the PNC was no longer the PNC, it was the APNU. It was a conglomeration of other political entities. Most of them didn't have much power. And they had put a new candidate, David Granger, who was relatively unknown at the time. They elected to do what they did. One of the things the Alliance for Change failed to do, and I say this with the greatest respect because I was chairman at the time, and I did urge that this be done, is to address the real issue in Guyana, which is race. We don't have an ideological difference between the PPP and the PNC, or Africans and Indians and their approach to life. We have a racial issue, which is really about, one, power. And what power gives you is how you're going to distribute the resources of the country. Both of these major political parties, attempt to influence, the judiciary, who they appoint. The person who they appoint is always perceived as their man for the job. So, of course, once you do that, the other side has a perception that that person is going to always give decisions in your favor. And so the Alliance for Change should have taken the bull by the horns and had an open, frank discussion about race. And the reason I say that is that you can't hide race in a country like Guyana. It is very easy to have, at election time, people come and give you the most beautiful 30-second, 60-second, 5-minute documentaries on how beautifully we live together. They take the pictures of somebody that is pretty like Jurita. You put her next to some good-looking person like Sherrod, and they got some Douglas-looking child running around. And those are very emotive issues, and they go work. You take somebody from a rural community that, some Indian girl, she marries some Morvan Bana who little rootsy, and you think that you solved the racial issue. You got to be on some serious psychotropic substances to believe that you can solve the racial issue by propaganda. You can't. You have to have a frank discussion. I failed as chairman to be able to do that, but the issue is, unless you confront it, and the population sees that you're confronting it. And that's one of the problems that I think the AFC faced as I wrap up by touching it. So here is something that I urge you to ponder. The Alliance for Change, when they had to go, well, they didn't have to. If it had gone into they went into an alliance with the People's National Congress called APNU. Think of how the APNU will see you, and it's no different from how the PPP will see you. If they went into alliance and they knew that you're the only reason they're in power, they are going to try and make sure they either take over your supporters or they diminish your standing because they don't want you to have the power over whether or not you are in power. So whether it's the PPP or the PNC, just think the other way around. If the Alliance for Change went into an arrangement with the PPP, while they were in a coalition with the PPP would be doing everything to undermine the AFC ministers because they will be attempting to take away the support of the Alliance for Change. That's a fact of life. That is politics. So you happen to go with the APNU, but the PPP would have behaved no differently. They might have used different tactics, but their objective would have been the same, which would have been that they wanted to take away your support because who are you, the upstart, to come between us and the other side where we want to exercise absolute power? However, the other thing we have to bear in mind, and I said this to my wife the other day, the Alliance for Change had no history of ever being in power. So you didn't have any elder statesman or stateswoman that you could go to say, here now, how do you deal with this situation politically? These were people that came together, committed to the country. They didn't have a history. Raphael had no history of being in government. Cambridge had a history of being in the ruling party, but not really in power. So they were being driven by their idealism to push Guyana forward. But you know, next to idealism is all the bandits, the crooks, and the cockroaches. It is when you get into power and people of influence and power come to you and try to influence the way you make your decisions. And I'm not talking about corruptly here. Influence the way so that they could benefit economically is when you really get the true test of how you manage. And the problem the AFC faced is that they could have been fighting the strongest battle. I was in a cabinet, so I don't know. I never asked my wife. They could have been fighting the strongest battle in cabinet to advance the ideals of the Alliance for Change, whether it's constitutional reform, bridge over the Demerara River, whatever. The fact is that because we on the outside never knew what they were doing, and because they wanted to keep this image of an alliance, a coalition together, they always would be perceived as having gone along with what the PNC was saying. And in Guyana, that is interpreted as they were always going with the black man. So if people don't know what battles you're fighting, if you don't have good propaganda, if you don't have a strong party, if you don't have, and this is one of the lessons I think you may wish to consider, is that the Alliance for Change, when they were in office, you took out their 5 or 7 people and you put them as ministers. They became completely imprisoned and could not speak independently of the government. So where you should have had a strong chairman outside of the party, strong general secretary outside of those ministers, sorry, not the party, articulating the AFC position. So if it was in an Indian community, you needed a strong leader, because we still essentially are racially biased in our approach. You needed a strong leader saying, no, the people of Enmore don't want this, even if it's PPP people you're fighting for. This is what they want for their community. And similarly in the African community, because a lot of what the Granger administration did, a lot of the African people did not support. The AFC also needed a strong person outside of those ministers articulating every single week, twice a week in the public, saying, they don't care what their minister's doing. This is our position on principle and policy. Don't go on race, because race, if you surrender to race, you're surrendering to the PPP and you're surrendering to the PNC. You have to articulate it on principle and policy. And so the perception of the Alliance for Change was that, of course, they were running with the PNC and they were running with the black people. Another fallacy, because the votes that were critical to defeat the PPP in 2015, they had to come from the Indian population. A lot of people don't, and data analysis is very important. A lot of people didn't realize that a lot of African people who came out to vote for the coalition in 2015 came out to vote for the coalition because of the AFC, not because of the PNC. They were convinced, for whatever reason, that because of these leaders you had, David and Raphael and Kathy and all of them, that they were going to go out and take the chance. And there were a lot of Indians who did not necessarily vote for the Alliance for Change, but did not go out to vote. So we fast forward to 2020. We know how we got here. We know what happened with the no confidence vote. I remember saying to a PPP person, if the PPP really were smart, they would have had an African member of the coalition vote for the no confidence. Because what Charan Das did was Charan Das reinforce and deepen the suspicions between the race. Charan Das was Indian. He voted with the PPP. So, of course, the consequence of that is it is going to become even harder for a party like the Alliance for Change to be able to address it. The way forward, my humble recommendation is that we have to commit to truth. We don't want to have a debate of rhetoric. So we have to start collecting data. And one of the big areas, because politics is about power, and power ultimately is about how you're going to share the corn. I know, again, enough cost fit, but all of this thing here is about how this corn gets shared. And therefore, before you could talk about sharing the corn, you got to know how the existing corn sharing. So you need to have a realistic picture of how the pie is shared. So if it is that the indigenous people collectively in this country only own 2% of the economic pie, then we got to address that because they ain't 2% of the population. Similarly, if the African people only own 10% of the economic pie and they are 28% or 32%, you have to address that. And you can only start to address this economic problem by looking at data. And that data has to be desegregated on the basis of race so we could begin to address the problem by, at the end of the day, all government really should be doing is determining policy. And at least if there is an area where some part of the population is being excluded or not being afforded the opportunity, then you have to address that by policy. So you need to look at the education figures. What percentage of which set of people are going where? Who is qualifying? Who's getting the better jobs? Because you can only govern a society ultimately if you have that information and you react to the differences. Now, I used to be a big supporter of constitutional change. I still am, but I think it is less significant in bringing our people together. Because you could change the constitution, but if at the end of the day it gets manipulated, and we don't have the people who are committed to its principles, then we have a problem. I think I wasn't alive in the early 60s when they had the Civil War, if I can put it that way. But I think the country at the moment is at its worst level that I have seen it in my living history of race relations. Worst. And yes, you can talk about democracy, but as I said before, the Ethnic Relations Commission, democracy does not have any relationship with equality or equal opportunity. So you could be, if you have 3 marbles and I have 2 and somebody else has 1, in any election, you can always win. It doesn't mean that when you win and you have to distribute the corn, share the corn, that you are going to share it equitably. You might say that, look, I have won the democratic election, I've gotten the most votes, but I want to share the votes with the people who vote for me, and the others don't have an opportunity. So the way forward is to begin this discussion on race. I think we've had an opening from the ERC, and I think the AFC needs to have internally, long before it goes internally, what its position is on race and politics, because politics is power, race in Guyana is power, and your topic today, which is ethnic power and racism in Guyana, is really the question of race in Guyana.